This episode is sponsored by Vinnie Tortorich and Peter Pardini's Fat, a documentary. Now available for pre-order on iTunes.
I'm pissed off. The reasons that the ketogenic diet hasn't become more popular has nothing to do with efficacy at all.
In the dietary guidelines for Americans, they recommend fewer calories, less fat, less saturated fat, less cholesterol.
The history of science is full of commonsensical facts that turned out to be dead wrong when we did the science.
Less sugar, less salt, more fiber.
You're telling people what to do, how to do it, and everyone's just throwing their hands up going, I'm going to do the best I can.
The myths have become ingrained in our society too strongly for people to realize they're myths.
What are some of the health myths we hear every day?
Grains are good for you and fat is bad for you.
Calorie in, calorie out.
A low-fat diet is a healthy diet.
We saw fat in the coronary arteries, and that must come from ingested fat.
There's incontrovertible evidence that saturated fat is bad.
Like hot oil down a cold stovepipe. It would just clog up your arteries and give you a heart attack.
It doesn't take long for media to pick up on these things, and we don't realize it's happening, but it's happening right in front of us.
I realized that we had gotten it completely upside down and backward on fat.
Imagine someone who spent his whole career getting the wrong answer. Not only are you wrong, you're completely wrong. Imagine the press release you would have to write. Dear American public, we're sorry if we killed prematurely your loved ones and your parents, and maybe we're killing you, but in retrospect, we shouldn't have given the advice we did.
If you think it's up to government, you're wrong. If you think it's up to industry, you're wrong. It's up to you.
Click on the photo image to the left at fascinationstreetpod.com to take you directly to the iTunes pre-order page. I believe that everybody has a story, and I'm fascinated to hear them. So come with me as we take a walk down Fascination Street. Welcome back, Streetwalkers. This episode is with author Michael Ames. He's the author of the new book about the Bowe Bergdahl story called American CIPHER. In this episode, we talk about him growing up sort of on the East Coast, and then we start talking about American CIPHER and the Bowe Bergdahl story. The story is not what you think it was. It was reported wildly inaccurately, and this investigation took years before they were able to write this book. So I would encourage everybody to go check out this book. There is a giveaway in this episode, so pay attention. And without further ado, this is my interview with author Michael Ames.
Yeah, talk to me, yeah.
Welcome to Fascination Street Podcast, Michael Ames. How you doing today, Michael?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Now, your last name Ames, you wouldn't happen to be from Iowa, would you?
No, I grew up in New Jersey, actually, before I moved out west after college. So no relation to the Iowa town, but I've been there.
Oh, you have. I think there's isn't Iowa State or Iowa U there or something?
I forget which one. I think University of Iowa.
I should know that because my best friend was born and raised there and went to both of those schools, but I don't because I'm terrible.
It is the Iowa State University, so we both kind of had it.
There you go. So did you say you're from Jersey?
I am. I grew up in New Jersey until I left for college in Maine, and then I moved directly out to Idaho when I was 22 years old, and I lived in Idaho for almost 10 years.
Okay, so that's a lot to unpack. I don't want to move past the fact that we only know two things about Idaho. One, obviously potatoes, and two, that's where crazy nut bars who have compounds and guns live. So which one are you? Are you a potato or a crazy nut bar?
I guess if those are my only choices, I'll go with potato.
I was hoping you'd say potato.
But Idaho is a wonderful state. I moved there because I was a ski bum and I wanted to ski and I wanted to write for a local newspaper. And I found that in 2002, Ketchum, Idaho, I could do both. I got a job teaching skiing at the Sun Valley Resort and a job reporting as a sports reporter for a little newspaper there called the Idaho Mountain Express.
Well, that sounds like the best of both worlds.
It was. I was watching a lot of my friends from college in the East Coast go off to, corporate jobs in Boston and Washington and New York. And at 22, I didn't really want any of that. And I think I was extra lucky. There was a little sort of mini recession there when I graduated college. The first tech boom had gone bust. And so there weren't a lot of jobs anyway. So I took the opportunity to light out for the frontier.
Well, that's really cool. What are the home prices and the cost of living like in Idaho? It can't be like either one of the coasts, right? It's got to be more like, sort of San Antonio and stuff.
It was so affordable when I got there. I mean, now it's been kind of discovered, and it was the fastest growing state in the country last year, and I think it's been in the top 5 now for the last 5 to 10 years. But no, rent was really affordable. So I lived in Blaine County, which is the county where Bowe Bergdahl grew up. We'll get to that in a bit. But I was able to teach skiing and write for the paper and afford rent. And, I did a lot of odd jobs. A lot of people in a ski town do, waiting tables and working catering and stuff like that. But it was affordable. You could have a really nice life with not much of without having to worry much about salary. You could have a really great lifestyle. And that, in my 20s, I wouldn't have traded it for anything.
That sounds awesome. And also jealous. I've been to a lot of, to me, it's a lot of states. Growing up, I never really thought I would ever leave San Antonio. And so, I've probably been to, 15, 17 states, something like that. And Idaho's on the list, and I've pretty much been everywhere around it, but I haven't quite made it to Idaho yet.
Well, definitely get there. You would love it. It's really beautiful. In the wintertime, there's serious mountains and great skiing and snowshoeing, snowmobiling, everything like that. It's a true, everything that people go to Colorado and Utah for, you can have in Idaho, but with less crowds and really have it to yourself. And then in the summertime, there's just so much to do. There's whitewater rivers, free running, wild rivers. It's the most rugged state in the country, and it has the most public land. Well, I'm sorry, let me give you an exact statistic here. It has the largest roadless area of any state in the lower 48. And that's right in the center of the state. So there's just a huge wilderness that's wonderful for camping, fishing, hunting, biking, whatever you want to do. And it's public lands. And I actually, one of my jobs in Idaho, I briefly worked on a campaign for the governor of Idaho. Our whole campaign centered around protecting public lands because it really is the personality and the identity of that state.
Was that governor successful in his campaign or her campaign?
No, we lost. We came pretty close. A 7-point loss to the eventual 3-term governor, Butch Otter. I worked for a man named Jerry Brady, who was a conservative Democrat, and I was getting a little stir crazy in the small town I lived, so they offered me a job, and I went and did it for 6 months, and I was still in my mid-20s, so it was a pretty cool experience. I got to really, in that job, I got to really know and understand the whole state of Idaho, and it's called the Gem State for a reason. I think that's because they found a lot of gems there, but it's also a gem itself.
How quaint. Now, you said you can do just about everything in Colorado you can do in Idaho. I'm going to go ahead and guess, except for buy weed and now in Denver, mushrooms.
Yeah, okay, you got me there. It's a very conservative state. It's the second largest Mormon population in the country after Utah, so it is very conservative. They say they're libertarian, but I never really saw it in the state government. The state government's much more socially conservative than I think the libertarian label would have one think. So they've got a little catching up to do in that regard. But like I said, it's the fastest growing state in the West, fastest growing state in the country last year. Boise is the fastest growing city in the country. So it is going to change. And I don't think it'll catch up in terms of buying weed for a little while. But, I think that's spreading everywhere.
Yeah, I think that scale has tipped, and it's going to be everywhere soon. So there you go.
Sure.
Now, like I said, I haven't been to Idaho, but last summer my wife was doing a contract job in Evanston, Wyoming, which is sort of in the corner I think it's about 2 hours from the Salt Lake City airport. And, I went up and visited her. And so, I flew into Salt Lake City and she picked me up, and then we drove to Evanston, Wyoming. And then the next day we drove to Colorado where this wedding was. And I don't know if you've ever made the trip from, I guess Evanston, Wyoming to wherever the hell I was, Colorado, but it's a lot of winding roads and no street lights and no, I'm from the city, so no street lights, no guardrail when you're, circling up mountains and whatnot.
Right.
And I was driving a little Mini Cooper, and the headlights were fine, but, not what I was used to being in the city. I mean, you're out there in the pitch black.
Yeah.
And the craziest thing that I saw on that trip was, so I was driving down the road, and it's just a 2-lane road, 1 lane going each way. And it's, I don't know, the middle of the darkest night. And I'm driving down the road. I'm doing probably 55 because I can't really see as well as I'd like to. So I'm going a little bit slower than I probably should. And right next to me, all of a sudden, is a bear.
A bear. Yeah.
But he was running the same direction as me. So, I just look over and there's a bear that's sort of running along next to my car. And, it happened so fast that by the time I could even point it out to my wife, it was gone, and it was behind us and you couldn't see anything at night.
Yeah.
And I feel like she didn't believe me, but it was brown and it was running away from me. And it wasn't, because like I said, we were in a Mini Cooper and it wasn't bigger than my car. So I want to say it was probably like a teenager bear. And the only thing that I remember, and I tell everybody this, is that when a bear is running and you're seeing the back of it, it is just as cute as you would imagine.
I bet.
But also, from then on, I was wide awake and terrified for the rest of the trip. So, where in New Jersey are you from?
I am from West Orange, New Jersey, which is just due west of New York City, about 15 miles. Jersey is kind of split into, you're either from the New York part or you're from the Philadelphia part. And so I grew up in the New York part. It's New Jersey's underrated. I didn't want to stay there in my 20s. I got out. But now that I live in the area again, I appreciate where I'm from.
So my wife had a couple of meetings or a conference or something in New York City. And so I was like, well, hell yeah, I want to go. And so what we did, because, New York City's pretty pricey and her meetings and conferences stuff were in Manhattan. So what we decided was we would stay in, a decent hotel in Rahway, New Jersey, and then just take the train into the city.
Yeah, works pretty well, right?
We have been, she had to go to New York for, 3 or 4 times, and every single time we would just stay in Rahway because we liked it so much. New Jersey does get a bad rap, but once you go there, it's so pretty. It's so beautiful. The people are way nicer than you guys are portrayed on TV.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But my biggest takeaway, and I tell everybody if they have the chance, if they're anywhere near Rahway, New Jersey, across from the Rahway train station, which for some reason has a statue of Nikola Tesla, directly across from the train station is a restaurant called Nancy's Townhouse, and that is hands down the best pizza I've ever had in my entire life.
All right. Well, this is a pizza part of the country over here, so.
Indeed. Everybody talks about New York this and Chicago that, but I'm going to tell you folks right here, New Jersey knows what's up with pizza.
Italian food in general in New Jersey, that's something I would miss when I lived out in Idaho. The Italian food in New Jersey is just a step above anywhere else in the country I've ever been.
It's really weird. Whenever I tried to order, the first time when I tried to order a pizza, I was like, yeah, I need a cheese pizza. And they were like, oh, you mean a cheese pie? And I was like, I don't know what all that noise was, but yes, that is exactly what I meant.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. And Rahway isn't exactly the prettiest part of New Jersey either, but I'm glad you found a spot to visit. And from there, you can get to the Jersey Shore, which is pretty fantastic, and you're close to the city.
Really close to the city. I think Rahway is 6 train stops away from, Madison Square Garden or whatever that stop is.
Yeah, Penn Station, Madison Square Garden, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. And what's really crazy is that I think it was maybe the last time we were there, I think it was a week later or 2 days after we left, there was a bomb that blew up at the Linden train station.
Oh, yeah.
And that is one of the stops between Rahway and the Garden. So we were like, holy shit, we stopped there all the time.
Yeah, I remember that was a weird one. I don't remember the details, but it's part of the New York City metropolitan area, so you never know what's going to happen.
That's true. And this is also weird, and I might be incriminating myself here, but I think it was the time previous to that we went to New York and stayed in Rahway. When my wife went to her conference in Manhattan, I went to Hoboken just because I'm a huge Frank Sinatra fan, and so I went to all the Frank Sinatra places in Hoboken. And the day after we left from that trip, the Hoboken train slammed into the station and killed people.
Oh, yeah, that was terrible.
I swear it's not me.
Maybe you shouldn't come back, actually.
Well, you know what? Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe I shouldn't go anywhere, because the first time we went to, well, the only time we went to Paris, 2 days after we got back was that Charlie Hebdo bombing.
Oh, God, yeah.
So maybe I just shouldn't go anywhere.
Yeah, just stay put. Keep everyone safer that way.
For the betterment of the world. I'm just trying to do my part to keep everybody safe.
Exactly.
So you grew up in Jersey, and then did you say you went to school in Maine?
I did. I went to college in a small college called Colby College, which is in Waterville, Maine, which is central Maine. So very long, cold, pretty bleak winters.
And what made you pick Maine?
Oh, I loved Maine. When I was a kid, growing up in New Jersey, every summer in August, my parents would rent a little cabin on the lake for 2 weeks. And so from the time I was, old enough to walk, my whole life would always spend a couple weeks on a little lake in Maine. And so I just always loved it, had a spot in my heart for it. Of course, that was in August when we would do that. And going to college in Maine, I lived there from September to May, which is, you get some nice climate in September, October, and May, but otherwise it's, November to April, it's pretty much winter. Long, gray winters, but made wonderful friends there, had friends for life. I majored, it was a small college, so they didn't have a journalism program there, but I majored in art history, which I really enjoyed and found it to be good prep, actually, strangely, for journalism. I started a humor magazine there, so I already had some impulses towards writing and journalism and doing things kind of a little bit edgy and counter-narrative, and had a lot of fun.
A humor magazine like Mad Magazine or like National Lampoon?
Well, a lot of the bigger colleges have humor magazines, and I was always jealous of kids I knew who were working for those. So, kind of like satire, like The Onion.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
At our best. We were young, so some of it was pretty silly. I'm not too proud of every joke we made, but we did our best, and we tried to keep things light at a time when things were getting a little serious or a little too politically correct.
Well, I've never been to that school, but I've got to assume that the stuff you were writing was for people who were in your demographic to read. You weren't writing it for, old white guys, right? You were just writing it for your age group. So I'm sure it wasn't as silly then as looking back on it you think it is now.
Oh, thank you. I think that's probably a fair point.
So you weren't terrified to go to Maine?
Terrified? Oh, because of Stephen King?
Yes.
I grew up reading those stories.
All of the bad shit happens in Maine.
It is spooky. I mean, it is, in the summertime, it is one of the most beautiful places in the country. It is, evergreen forests and lots of wildlife, and the weather is incredible. It's never too hot. And they call it vacation land. That's the icon on every license plate. It's affordable, and it's a place where time kind of stands still. There's towns there that look just like they did in the 1950s, and things just don't change there very much. And that's it just made me appreciate the slower pace of life. I was not afraid, despite the Stephen King stories. I loved it, and you got to add Maine to your list, Maine and Idaho. I hope that comes out of our interview. You can get to both these places.
That's the only thing I want everybody to get out of today's episode. Just kidding. So now is the part of the interview where I ask everybody the exact same question, regardless of their sex or religion or political affiliation. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Tell me everything you know or learned about corduroy.
You don't ask everyone this question.
No.
That's funny. I always liked corduroy. I guess I just had corduroy pants growing up, but I saved up some money and went to visit a friend in London, and then we went to Lisbon, Portugal. And just an incredibly beautiful city, also kind of a place out of time. It just felt like stepping back decades. When I was there, 2006, not a lot of franchises. I've heard it's changed. I've only been there that once. And there was just a lot of corduroy. It just seemed everybody, men particularly, were wearing corduroy blazers, corduroy suits, corduroy pants. And I was totally charmed by it. I wanted to find a corduroy suit for myself, but Portuguese men are quite a bit shorter than me, and I couldn't find anything that fit. And I don't know what came over me, but I decided I wanted to write an essay about it, and there was a magazine at the time called The Believer, still around, good creative magazine. They did reviews of objects, so instead of reviewing a book or a movie or a restaurant, you could review just any old object, your tea kettle or your screwdriver or your nightstand. And so I decided I was going to write a little review of the corduroy that I tried to find in Portugal. And then I'll never forget the phone call or email I got from someone saying, "I'm Miles and I represent the Corduroy Appreciation Club." And I thought it was
Sorry.
And I thought it was a joke. And it was sort of a joke, but it was a joke that they took very seriously. And they invited me to talk at this annual meeting, which they held, of course, on November 11th, because the date 11/11 is the date that most resembles corduroy.
Oh, my God.
And it was totally silly, totally absurd like that. And they asked me to read the essay, and I did, and it was great. But I have a lot of fun memories about it. But one of the most amazing parts of this annual meeting was when they had everyone in the room. And to get in the room, you had to be wearing at least 2 articles of corduroy. So almost everyone is wearing corduroy pants. And the room, they probably had about 300 people there. And at one point, they had everyone in the room stand up and go completely silent and start rubbing their legs together. And, like walking in place. And it seemed like the silliest thing until after about 5 to 10 seconds of this, you could definitely hear this sort of whooshing hum take over the whole room. And then everyone just cracked up laughing as all of everyone's corduroy pants, the noise that they make when you walk. So we had 300 people doing this at the same time. We got a pretty loud corduroy sound. And you had to have been there, but it was a wonderful moment.
That actually sounds really, really cool.
Yeah, it was funny.
That trip that my wife and I took to Paris when we were, trying to figure out what clothes we were going to take, because we were there for, I don't know, like a week or 10 days or something. I went and bought a pair of black corduroy pants. We went around Christmas time, so it was winter. And whenever I told people that I was taking corduroy pants, they were like, "Who the hell has corduroy pants? Like, where do you even find that? What's wrong with you?" But I tell you what, when I got there, I was not the only person wearing corduroy. There was lots and lots of Parisians wearing corduroy, so I felt like the cool kid.
Oh, yeah. It's a timeless fabric. It'll never go out of style. It's kind of warm, but not hot, comfortable. Can't say enough about it.
Well, I'm right there with you.
Hey, streetwalkers. Well, you're not literally streetwalkers, but now that I've got your attention, I am Stephen O'Reilly, and I have a podcast called the Bar Star Podcast. And since you're listening to the Fascination Street podcast, I think you should check out my show. It's just as interesting without all the famous people, because Steve has connections that I just do not have. But if you dig podcasts about music, working musicians, and other random shit that I decided to talk about, based around music, of course, because that's what I do. I'm a working musician for the past 30 years, then you need to check out the Bar Star Podcast. You can get it wherever you get your podcast, on any platform, and make sure you check out barstarpodcast.com. Now back to the one and only Steve Owens and whatever the hell he was talking about.
Now we're going to move on to your book.
Yeah.
So if I'm correct, American CIPHER is your first book. Is that right?
It's my first serious book. I've done a couple. I made some money when I was younger doing a couple of little things, but this is my first serious journalism book. That's right.
What couple of little things did you make money on when you were younger?
Oh, they were like coffee table books, things my agent tells me not to talk about. So if he's listening, I'm sure he'll shake his head. I did a book about the history. It was a coffee table book about the history of cruiser bicycles. And I did another book about the World Beard and Mustache Championships. That one was published in the UK, but They were fun. I was young. They were good practice. I'm glad I did them, but this was a real undertaking, so we should talk about the book, the current book.
We definitely should, but just a little note to your editor, who hopefully he's listening. I think you said your editor, right? Or your publisher, whoever it was.
Yeah.
As far as books that people don't talk about, Neil Gaiman's first book that was only released in the UK was sort of a biography on the band Duran Duran.
Oh, yeah.
And he doesn't talk about it at all, and they didn't produce many copies. But if you happen to find one, it's worth about $50,000.
Wow. Okay.
So take that, editor guy, publisher person.
Noted.
Now, we're going to talk about American CIPHER. For those of you who might not be in the know, there is a popular podcast called Serial, and I think that in part is what sort of helped make podcasting mainstream. The first season was about a possibly wrongly convicted kid who went away for murder. Season 2 was about Private First Class Bowe Bergdahl, who on June 30th, 2009, left his platoon's base in eastern Afghanistan. Now, what ensued was a desperate search and lots of military action and whatever trying to find this kid. And when they finally did find this kid, they put him on trial for, I guess, desertion. And fun fact, last I knew, at least maybe during the trial, he was in, I guess, the brig here in San Antonio.
Well, he wasn't in jail. Just to clarify, he was never in the brig. He was working a full-time job at U.S. Army North, but he was never in prison or in the brig there.
Seriously? I had no idea.
That's right. He was active duty. He was working a administrative job there, but and he was doing twice daily for a long time, debriefing interviews with U.S. intelligence agents, but he was never in jail.
Well, thank you for clearing that up. I had absolutely no idea. I thought he was in jail, so thank you for that. So, Michael, what got you... First, I don't want to point out how this interview happened. I reached out to Bowe Bergdahl's attorney, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Rosenblatt, while the trial was going on. And although he didn't feel comfortable because of his... attorney-client relationship, he didn't really feel comfortable doing an interview with me at that time, but we have sort of kept in touch back and forth. A couple of weeks ago, he did reach out to me and let me know that he ran into you, and he sort of put us together. So thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Rosenblatt. I appreciate that.
Definitely.
And that's how this happened. So, Michael, like you said, this is your first serious journalistic book. What made you decide to investigate this story and write this story and get involved in this particular story? What about this story drew your attention?
Well, I got to say, I think the story chose me as much as I chose it. I mentioned to you that I was living in Idaho in my 20s and early 30s. That's where Bowe Bergdahl grew up. I was living in his hometown. So we knew people in common, and when he was a captured soldier and a POW, and the longest held POW, I think it's really important for people to remember this. He was the longest held American POW since Vietnam. And while he was being held, I lived in his hometown and we had a lot of friends in common. And his father, Bob Bergdahl, was actually my UPS driver.
Really?
Yeah. So, for me, the story was something that was around me in my everyday life. And I was working at the time as a magazine editor for a local quarterly magazine there in that resort community. And then I moved away. He was still in captivity. And then the day he was released, I'll never forget it. I'm sure a lot of your listeners will remember seeing the helicopter footage, the grainy footage of him being walked to the helicopter. At that point, I had moved back to the East Coast, and the ensuing political firestorm, which took everyone's attention, took mine as well. But there were things about it that just struck me as not quite right. And what I was seeing in the media sounded not quite right. And I was already a reporter, so I decided to pick up the pieces and start looking into it myself. And thus began a, now 5-year journey with this story.
So you said he is the longest prisoner of war since Vietnam. How long was he a POW?
He was held captive for just under 5 years. And all of that time in isolation, in solitary confinement. And over 3 years, he lived in a cage.
Wow. So back to one of the reasons that I thought that he was in jail when he was here in San Antonio, that was, like you said, it was all over the news. It was a very polarizing subject. Lots of military folk were pretty divided about what should happen to Mr. Bergdahl. So I kind of thought that he might be in jail a little bit for his own protection, because the people who were mad at him were furious.
Oh, yeah. It's hard to pin the blame on any one particular person, though there were a small handful of public figures who came out and called him a traitor and who blamed him for things that were not, in fact, his fault, as it turned out later. But in those first days, look, when he walked off his post in 2009, let's rewind. Who is this guy? What did he do? He walked off his combat post in 2009, which is a crime. I'm seeking to tell this story from every point of view, but I do not defend what he did. I think what he did is indefensible. And he abandoned his post, and he abandoned the guys who he had a duty to fight with. He also didn't tell anyone what he was doing or why. So he, within hours, is taken captive by the Taliban, and for 5 years, no one knows what he did or why. And people can only guess, and rumors and innuendo and gossip took the place of real facts. And the Taliban has a very functional and effective propaganda arm, and they were able to plant stories in the Western media. One very good British newspaper, the Times of London, published in August of 2010, a story detailing from a Taliban commander, and it sounded like an exclusive story. And it was all about how Bergdahl had converted to Islam and changed his name to Abdullah and was teaching seminars to Taliban soldiers. Well, that was made up from whole cloth. It turned out that none of it was true, but it ran in the papers. It got picked up by other newspapers, and the seed was planted. And the seed was planted by Taliban propaganda very intentionally. So fast forward years to him being released and everyone believing and saying, well, we know that this guy's a traitor. That originally came from Taliban propaganda. And, the Taliban must have just been pinching themselves, thinking how lucky they could be to see American media recycling their own talking points.
Now, a couple of things. I do want to say that being in captivity and in isolation for 5 years, that's a really, really long time for a narrative to be built without any resistance or, another side. So that's a pretty tough mountain to climb, when you get out and you're like, wait, what does everybody think happened about me? And the whole world thinks this? So that's a long time for a story to build without having an opportunity to hear the other side.
That's right. I agree with that.
Now, as far as that story that came from the London paper?
Taliban.
Yeah, from the Taliban. I think it is sort of interesting that although you didn't mention it, one of the key figures who spoke the loudest against Mr. Bergdahl is also the loudest proponent of fake news.
Yes. Well, I didn't know, I figured we would get there, but I wasn't sure what your take on it was. But yes, so I can tell you the exact way that news was spread when he was released. So first, a couple days after he was released, a man by the name of Richard Grinnell went on Fox News and said, with no evidence, that Bergdahl was looking for the Taliban. Richard Grinnell is a Republican operative. He was running a PR shop. He knows how to do political communication campaigns, strategic communication campaigns. And a source of mine over the years has been Roger Stone, who's an associate of Donald Trump, who I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with. And Roger Stone told me that he wouldn't even work with Richard Grinnell because he thought he was too shady and unscrupulous. So that puts things in perspective for you.
Take that in, everybody. Just let that sink in for just a second.
Yeah.
Wow.
So this guy, Richard Grinnell, who was too shady for Roger Stone to work with, goes on Fox News and says that Bergdahl was looking for the Taliban. No evidence. Later that same week, Donald Trump on Fox and Friends. This was July 2014, so a year before he declared himself a candidate. And he called Bergdahl a traitor. And that was just straight up repeating Taliban propaganda, and there was no basis for it, and it took off from there. And it's a very good, I think, in this way, the Bergdahl story in our book, American CIPHER, tells a really good story of how disinformation and fake news the way you put it, now really defines so much of our political conversation in this country. And I think the book shows how it works and how fake stories take over and get in the way of real, well, let me put it to you this way. We think, and the book shows, that the truth of the matter and the real history of the story is much more interesting than these political fictions.
Very well put. So let's talk about how you did get involved. Now, I know that you said that you had sort of a tangential relationship with, I guess, his father, sort of, and, you know, you kind of grew up in that area. So what were the steps? Like, how did you reach out? Because I know that you spoke with him and several times, I would imagine. So how did that process work? How did you reach out and make a connection?
Well, the first thing I didn't talk to his parents until the very end of this book writing process a little over a year ago. But in the beginning, right after he was recovered, I was a reporter I was freelance reporting, and I was writing for Harper's Magazine and Newsweek and the Daily Beast. So I did a quick story for the Daily Beast about a speech that Bob gave in 2010 when his son was captive, and that no other reporters had been there, and I'd been holding on to the notes for 4 years at that point. And that story went completely viral, and it was all about how in 2010, the CIA drone strike had taken out the son of one of the Taliban commanders. Well, the Daily Beast, called that. They said, they put a headline on it saying how similar that was to the Homeland series on Showtime, and that story went viral. And I said to myself, okay, I better keep with this thing. And then I went out to Idaho and did another story for Harper's about what had happened in town after what you and I just spoke about, after Donald Trump called him a traitor. There were death threats across all of that town. I mean, just dozens and dozens of death threats. That town was really shaken up. And this is a quiet, peaceful town. So this was really a major event for people there and a trauma that they went through. I then started reaching out to soldiers who had been fighting in Afghanistan at the time and who had been sent on the searches looking for him. And very quickly, I found soldiers who proved what I was already sensing, which is that these searches that they were sent on, for a couple of days, they were legitimate. They were saying, all right, we got to go find Bergdahl. But after a short amount of time, it was already in the news. It was already in the press, and the military and the U.S. government already knew that Bowe Bergdahl had been taken over the border to Pakistan. Once that knowledge was conveyed to people on the high levels, that knowledge was suppressed and ignored, and they turned that crisis of a missing soldier into an opportunity of the war. And they sent men on missions under false pretenses for months and months and months. And that's what enabled people to blame Bowe Bergdahl for so much of what happened.
Why do you think they did that?
I think they did that because it was an opportunity. And I know sources of mine who I interviewed for the Newsweek story said that they understood it. They knew that they were being lied to, but they defended it anyway. There's a quote from a former U.S. Army sergeant who said, I know it wasn't true, but I stand behind it 100%. They saw an opportunity and they took it, and it was the right thing to do at the time. So, military and war fighting strategy is different than what we do every day as civilians.
Well, that does make sense.
Yeah.
How long did you research this book before it came out?
Well, so I wrote then 3 long stories for Newsweek magazine about it over the course of 2015 and early 2016. And then I teamed up with my co-author on the book, who's a former Army infantryman, Matt Farwell, who fought in Afghanistan. And so he knew far more than I did about the Army and about how things work in the military and about that part of Afghanistan and Afghanistan as a whole. He lived through it. He experienced it. He went through, the hard times, and he fought and he served. And unlike Bowe, he didn't walk off. He served honorably. So he had mixed emotions about it too. But we teamed up in the end of 2015, early 2016, started reporting together as a team for a year. And he'd been looking into the story, and he worked on another story in 2012 for Rolling Stone. So he and I really had more background on the story than any other journalist in the country. I'd been working on it for 3 years at that point, and he'd been working on it for 5 years. So we were able to really join forces and get the true story. You mentioned Serial earlier, and Serial did a good job with the amount of time they had, but they also got a lot of things wrong, and a lot of their sources misled them, and they trusted Taliban sources, which didn't make any sense. whereas we were able to get a lot deeper knowledge from people who wouldn't talk to them.
Well, I did listen to both the first season and the second season of Serial, and they did a great job, but I feel like in certain places, in both cases, I feel like they sort of didn't finish the game, or I feel like there was really no closure for either one of those stories. And I sort of feel like maybe, I don't know if they ran out of time or if they just got busy doing other things, but I don't feel like either one of those stories was told, to its completion. But that said, they did a great job. I'm not mad at them because I wouldn't even know about this gentleman. Well, I probably would, but I wouldn't know as much about him if it wasn't for them.
Well, you should read what Bob Bergdahl says about them, because he wasn't too pleased, because, they didn't disclose on that podcast that how many decisions were being made by Mark Bowe, who's a Hollywood screenwriter. So it wasn't true journalism, and I think they had some inner conflict there where you have real journalists doing reporting, but then they also had a Hollywood screenwriter making decisions, and I think that led to some weird things happening and to, for instance, they recycled the Taliban propaganda about Bowe maybe being a traitor. And at the time they did that, it was already thoroughly documented that he wasn't. And I think that was very unethical what they did in that case. And while they did some things well, overall, I just can't escape the fact that they rehashed and recycled false information because they thought maybe it made a better story or something. I don't know. I can't speak for them. But that's when they kind of lost me.
Wait, did you say that they had a Hollywood screenwriter helping them produce that season of the podcast?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was the one interviewing Bowe. I mean, if you recall, they have tapes of Bowe speaking.
Right.
Well, they got those tapes from Mark Bowe, who's a Hollywood screenwriter and director who directed some very big films, including Zero Dark 30, which also has a lot of ethical problems with it. The movie about the supposed story of how we got bin Laden. He did The Hurt Locker. And so anyway, they got Bowe to agree to tell his story to them 3 days after he landed on U.S. soil. So here you have a traumatized torture victim who's been held in isolation for 5 years. And 3 days after he's back on U.S. soil, you have the Hollywood vultures circling and, getting him to agree to tell his story to them. Well, his legal case carried on for so long, they couldn't get the movie made, and then those tapes went to this podcast. They joined forces. This is all in the book. It's in American CIPHER. I really hope people, if they're curious about some of this media inside baseball, pick it up and give it a read. But yes, Mark Bowe was making decisions about how the podcast was going to run, and those decisions, in many instances, ran counter to what you would consider journalism.
Wow, I had no idea. So you actually sat down with Bowe, right?
We talked to him briefly, but we didn't get to interview him on the record for this, unfortunately. But I interviewed his parents last summer, and we were the only people who his parents have spoken to since their son was recovered.
Well, I don't know if you can tell me, but where is he right now? Is he in San Antonio?
I actually don't know for sure.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. He's under smart advice not to reach out and talk to the media and not to let people know where he is, because there's still a lot of people who would do him harm. So I literally could not tell you where he is. I do not know.
Well, let me ask you this. It's been a while, and my memory's kind of fuzzy. How did his trial end?
Well, he received a dishonorable discharge, which is a serious punishment. People wanted him in jail, but a dishonorable discharge from the Army is no laughing matter. It's the equivalent of a felony. He received a reduction in rank to E1 and a forfeiture in pay of 10 months, so I think $10,000. And while I'm still waiting for the Army to confirm this, it also sounds like he will not get any medical benefits, which a lot of people, that's what they wanted. They wanted him to have no medical benefits. But considering what he suffered through in 5 years, I think that's not the right decision. And I think he deserves some health insurance for what he went through, and considering that the Army awarded him for his captivity. The narratives that are out there on this story do not match the facts. And the fact is, his conduct in captivity was appropriate in almost all cases. He was a huge intelligence help when he came home. The Army gave him 2 awards for his conduct in captivity. And I think based on everything he went through, unimaginable torture and neglect and isolation, that he deserves some medical benefits.
It seems odd that they would give him 2 awards and then take away his medical benefits. That seems incongruous.
Right? I couldn't agree more.
Wow.
But I believe that's the case. I can't confirm it because the Army won't confirm that for me yet, but that sounds like the case.
Well, I'm going to reach out to Mr. Army, and I'm going to ask him myself, and I'll get to the bottom of it. Just kidding.
Okay, please let me know what Mr. Army said.
I'm going to reach out to the CEO of the Army.
Yeah, sounds good.
Wow, that is insane. So were there things, I mean, I'm sure there was a lot, but what is the thing that you learned that stands out the most, that was sort of diametrically opposed to what you thought going in?
That's a good question. I guess, I haven't had anyone ask me quite that way. I guess the legal procedure and the way that it was guided really surprised me, because the facts seemed quite clear by the time the trial was in its final stages. And the difference between the facts and the false narratives on cable news, to anyone really involved in the story, seemed quite clear that there were 2 different narratives. One based in fact that was well documented by the Army's internal investigations and by everyone who was involved in the case. And then there was the version that was on cable news at night. And these 2 versions were completely different. And I figured, well, the Army is full of good people who I met with integrity, and certainly the facts will win out and will determine the way the case is handled. But what I saw was that when you get to such a high level of a national political issue like that, the ability for the media to determine the way things are handled cannot be underestimated. And external facts such as Donald Trump and what was happening on CNN and Fox News became way too important and were able to guide the legal trial in a way that really surprised me.
That is a great answer. And although it's not even close, I guess, in scope as far as the crime and whatnot, but there's a lot of similarities between the way it was reported and the actual facts. With the case of Matthew Shepard, I recently interviewed an author who wrote a book after, 13 years of investigative reporting on that case. And there's a lot of the same similarities about how what was reported sort of dictated rather than the facts. So
that was the case in Wyoming?
Yeah, Laramie, Wyoming.
Yeah, it happens. And I think there's a very weird cognitive dissonance, especially on the right in this country, where they say, well, we don't believe the media, and the media makes things up. And then meanwhile, the conservative media is very effective at constructing narratives in ways that don't match the facts. And not just the conservative media. It happens on CNN and MSNBC and the networks as well. But the ability for, and I think to get down to the nuts and bolts of it, there's a lot of people working in political communications and strategic communications. There was an interesting story in the Wall Street Journal several years ago now about how as journalism was collapsing and old school journalism and newspapers were collapsing, for every one journalist in the country, there's something like 4 or 5 PR strategists, public relations spinmeisters. And I think we're really paying a price for that. I think people who put out political narratives have far too much influence, and we're really as a society losing our grip on how to tell the difference between a political narrative and reality.
I could not agree more. Now, Michael, I have kept you for quite some time, and I could talk to you probably for the rest of the night, but that's not going to happen. So can you tell everybody where they can find you on social media? And if you have a website, can you tell it?
Yes, my website's a little behind the times, but I'm going to point people to our book, number 1. The book is called American CIPHER, Bowe, Bergdahl, and the U.S. Tragedy in Afghanistan. You can find it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and your local bookstore, bookseller. You can find it at Penguin Random House. I really, really encourage people to get the real story. The podcast was misleading. The news media is significantly misleading. If you want to really understand a story about your fellow Americans and people who fought in the war and Bowe's platoon mates and what they went through, and we tell the story from every side. So go out, find the book, American Cipher. You can find me on Twitter at Mirkel. That's Merkel. It's an old nickname. I never thought I'd be on a podcast using it professionally when I signed up for Twitter in 2009, but here we are. So follow me at Merkel, and definitely give the book a shot. It is also on audiobook at Audible, and tell your friends, because we wrote it as a true story. And I've had friends who I grew up with who say they never read military books before and they loved reading this. A young mom of 2 small kids sent me a photo of her reading it with her family on the beach. So, put down your preconceptions about military stories and give this one a try, because I promise you'll be engaged by the people and the characters who we met and the people who stood up and put a lot on the line to tell us the truth too. We have military guys who had to speak undercover and anonymously, and we owe a lot to our sources. And if for nothing else, people should go out and hear what they have to say.
And everybody, go ahead and scroll down to the show notes of this episode on my website, and there will be a link to that book on Amazon. So everybody go buy that book, check it out. And before I let you go, Michael, is there anything that we didn't talk about or I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about?
No, I think we covered everything. I really appreciate your time and your attention on this story. I think, we have a short-term memory problem in this country as well. And I think, this story is not that old and it deserves to still be remembered. Short-term, what were we talking about? Just kidding. So, what's funny is there has to be a link between our nation's short-term memory loss and the abundance of weed everywhere. I think it's got more to do with social media, personally, and technology, but, Yeah, you're right. We're short attention span country. On to the next thing. Michael Ames, thank you so much for taking the time out of your obviously busy and hectic schedule to let us get to know you a little bit better on Fascination Street. Thank you. I had a lot of fun. Take care. It was a blast, and I really enjoyed speaking with you and getting to know a little bit more about this story, and I definitely will be reading this book. And everybody listening, email me at fascinationstreetpod@gmail.com with just put in there what Michael's nickname was growing up that he's sort of embarrassed about. And I'm going to pick one of those emails and I'm going to give Michael's book away. So everybody email me and maybe you'll get a book. Sounds good. Thanks, Michael. Have a great day. All right. Thanks. You too. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye. As always, thanks for listening, Streetwalkers. And don't forget, follow the show on Twitter at FascinationSTPD, on Instagram at Fascination Street Pod. Follow the podcast page on Facebook at Fascination Street Podcast. And of course, you can always email me at fascinationstreetpod@gmail.com. And if you haven't already, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button and rate us on iTunes. For the next 3 months, everybody who rates and reviews the show and sends a screenshot to fascinationstreetpod@gmail.com will get a free surprise gift mailed to them. Every single one of you. So do it. Thanks, Streetwalkers. Opening music is the song Magnolia from the 2014 album Intransigence, used with permission from Douglas Miles Clark. Closing music is Apollo from the 2001 album Into the Known by the band CIPHER. Thanks for hanging out with us and getting to know a little bit about our guest. We'll see you next time on Fascination Street.